In this session today, let us see how to create a repository in GitHub account. Now, why we need to create a repository? As part of storing the files in the development process, I need a centralized location where I can store the data, nothing but the files. Not only that, I want to store the revision of this particular changes that I have done. Then I have to pick GitHub repository. In order to create a repository in your account, on the home page, we can see an option here called create repository. Or let us say you are using an existing repository, I want to import it to GitHub. Then we can use import repository. But since we want to create a new repository in this account, I can use this option, or we can see here as well. Now in this, again, we have two options. Do you really want to create a public repository or a private repository? What is meant by public repository? The repository which can be accessed by anyone on the internet. What does it mean? How we need to understand? Even though you're not part of this account, you don't have any authentication to this particular repository, but still I can download this repository or I can access the repository over the browser. That is called as public repository, but I cannot push any changes. Though it is a public repository, but still I cannot push any changes into this repository. That is called as public. What is meant by private? If I need to see any changes in the repository, or if I need to download the repository changes, or if I need to push my changes, I need to authenticate if it is a private repository. This is the basic difference between public and private. In the organizations, obviously, we will try to create a private repository. But if you are planning to create a repository to share across the people over the internet, maybe to share your knowledge or to share the open source code, in those conditions we have to go for public. Now let me try to create a private repository. Select this option which is by default and you can specify the name here, the one what you want to create. For example, let us say Docker development. I want to create a repository with this name. And then once we have specified it, we can just click on create new repository. And you can see the repository has been created. Now, how to communicate to this repository? We have multiple options here. But in order to reach this particular repository over the network, either we can use HTTPS protocol or we can use SSH. In the next session, we will see how to communicate to this repository and push our changes or pull the changes into our working station. Nothing but your local system. That we will see in the next topic. For now, we have seen how to create a private repository. For example, if you need to create a public repository, let's go back to the account. And then here we can see home page. And then let me try to create a new repository. Let me provide a name, container manifest. Done. This name is available and we can use it. And then description. If you want to provide a short description of what is the reason why we are creating this repository, you can specify the description. For example, in order to store, to say, or we can say, in order to provide information regarding containerization tools. That's it. I want to make sure this particular repository is public. You can say by default it got selected with public. And do you want to create any README file while creating this repository? In those conditions, we have to enable this option. What it does, by default, this repository will be created and it is going to create one file. That particular file is called as README. It is like a documentation. Sometimes when people are looking at repository, they want to read the documentation. How to set up it, if it is a software, how to configure that, or what is this particular tool is all about. I want to read some data. In those conditions, README file will help you a lot to understand the concept. It is a kind of documentation. I don't want to create any other file apart from README. in this repository what I'm trying to initialize. Further, if you want to create a git ignore file or a license file, we can enable these options. For now, I'm not doing it. And by default, every repository is going to create with a default branch. The default branch will be named as main. Earlier, few years back, the default branch name is master. In the recent times, they have renamed the default branch to main. That's the reason in older repositories, you might see a default branch as master. But don't get confused. That is an older name. This is a new name. And once you are okay with this, all the parameters what you have passed, we can just click on create repository. Now we can see the public repository has been created. We can see the tag here. When it is a private repository, if you look into this, you can see it is private tag and this is public. I hope this is clear in this particular session on how to create a public repository and how to create a private repository. Thank you.